Okay. Hello. It's a pleasure to present this webinar in the ATBC Neotropical chapter series. And today I'm going to talk about the role that tropical forests play in the Earth system. Now, like many tropical forest ecologists, there are many reasons why we're interested in tropical forests and their value, their biodiversity, their importance in the Earth system. But also one of the reasons that many of us like to do research in tropical biomes is because we love fieldwork in the tropics. We love seeing the vast biodiversity and complexity of tropical ecosystems. And one of my favorite things to do when I'm on fieldwork in the tropics is to, at the end of a day, is to sit out in a hammock, ideally, with a glass of nice whiskey in my hand and contemplate the vast biological infinity of complexity around me, and also to gaze up at a starry night, ideally, and look at the infinity of the stars above. And I'm a bit of a science fiction fan, so as part of this, I often try and imagine myself being on some far-off world, some sort of avatar-type planet, some full of a mysterious jungle world. And what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is try and persuade you that in many ways we do live in a jungle world, a tropical forest world, because tropical forests play such an important and significant role in the fundamental functioning of the Earth system and the presence and diversity of life on the Earth system. And here is one type of diagram that shows the importance of the tropics. And this type of diagram is called a cartogram, and this is one that we produced with my colleague Ben Hennig, who's now at the University of Reykjavik in Iceland. And what a cartogram does is present area, distort area to represent some sort of variable. So in this case, we have a map of the productivity of the terrestrial surface based on NODIS satellite data averaged over the year, but the area of the land surface is distorted according to the amount of productivity. So what we see overall in the year is that it's a familiar surface, but the continents are distorted. The tropics are much larger than we usually see them, and higher latitudes are smaller than we're used to seeing them. If we go to somewhere like January, what we see is that the tropics dominate completely. The northern hemisphere has largely shut down in terms of photosynthesis and has shrunk to almost nothing on this cartogram. And really, areas such as Brazil and the Congo and Indonesia are the largest countries on Earth in terms of their contribution to the overall functioning and biogeochemical cycling of the land surface. If we go to July, we see things are a bit more balanced. The tropics are still quite productive, but also there's been a great greening up of Eurasia and North America. And we see a more balanced picture of productivity distributed across the globe. And the deserts, the dry areas like the Sahara are still shrunk to almost nothing, being negligible in terms of productivity. And what we can do is combine these data month by month and come up with this sort of animation that shows the pulsing of productivity of the land surface. And this shows the relative importance of productivity at different times of the year. So what we see here is the tropics being disproportionately important in January, February, March, but also the northern hemisphere being more important relatively in July, August, September. And so overall, we get this annual heartbeat of the terrestrial surface, the pulse of productivity, the great green heartbeat of life on the land surface, at least. And this is now going back to the annual total here. And so what we have here is some sort of metric of the productivity, the energy flow through the surface, on the land surface. And one recurrent theme in my talk is to use this idea of energy flow or metabolism as a way of understanding both the functioning of the biosphere, what influence it has on the global planetary function, but also how increasing human presence is altering or becoming dominant relative to the natural biosphere processes. So how can we compare something like this, which is a metric of biological activity, with something like this? This is a map of global GDP wealth. There's a cartogram as well per unit area. And this could be taken as some sort of metric of economic activity. And here you see the dominant economically active zones of the world: North America, Europe, South and East Asia standing out particularly. So what are the ways that we could compare this metric of human activity, of human economic activity, with the previous slide, this metric of biological activity? And how do those two compare in terms of magnitude, in terms of planetary function? But the concept that I'm going to argue that we can use here is the concept of metabolism, of energy flow. With these diagrams of photosynthesis, it's fairly straightforward to turn an estimate of photosynthesis into an estimate of biological energy flow by just knowing the amount of energy in carbohydrate and the rate of production of carbohydrate. It's a simple multiplication factor that can convert biological photosynthesis into the energy flow, how much energy is being captured by the land biosphere every year. And so we can, in that way, describe the biological metabolism of ecosystems. And all organisms have a metabolism, whether animals or plants or fungi, and we understand that fairly well, and we can capture and describe our metabolism. But when we're thinking about human societies, we have to go beyond just thinking about our biological metabolism. Because beyond our simple biological activity, we use energy in lots of other ways for our transport systems, our infrastructure systems, the embodied energy in the food or the consumables that we consume, but that are manufactured far away and transported to us. So a concept that the industrial ecologists have come up to describe this wider concept of energy is the idea of extended metabolism or social metabolism. But also we can convert this into energy units of metabolism, and therefore we can compare this social metabolism with a planetary biological metabolism. And recently we've been doing some work trying to describe the social metabolism of the UK, the United Kingdom, as an example country in some detail. And this is work that's currently in review. And what we've done here is calculating in detail, using a range of econometric data, the metabolic profile of the UK. And the main thing to concentrate here is on the right, this diagram that shows what our metabolism is per capita and how it splits between different components. And what we see here is that about half of our metabolism in the UK is a typical industrialized European country. About half of our metabolism is embodied in the goods that we consume. That's shown in green. In orange, we see our direct domestic energy consumption. In green, we see our personal transport, our use of vehicles. And in the lighter beige color here, we have what's built into the infrastructure, our education, our health systems, or other component infrastructure systems. And in the yellow there, we see just 3 squares that represent our own biological metabolism. So what we see here is that our overall social metabolism is well over an order of magnitude greater than our simple biological metabolism. So there's a lot more energy flowing through us as interactive, social, complex beings than the simple biological energy that's apparent in our food consumption. And what we're able to do now with this sort of rich econometric data is describe this in detail, not only at national level, but in this example, go down into finer subnational scales. Then what we can do is to calculate this for countries or for regions or even for the whole planet and compare this to the amount of energy flowing through the Earth system. So if we look at the amount of energy flowing through the land system, and I'm going to focus mainly on land because human impacts are still overwhelming on land. Certainly the oceans have been impacted in many ways, from overharvesting of resources and many other components, but still the vast majority of our impact is on land, and so there we can compare ourselves more directly to terrestrial metabolism. So the total amount of energy flowing through the land surface is around 150 terawatts. That's the total amount of energy that flows through by the process of photosynthesis on the land surface. And if we compare this to the amount of energy flowing through humanity, we can calculate this for pre-industrial humanity around 10,000 years ago, when everybody on Earth was a hunter-gatherer, and we had a much smaller population. And we can do the calculations, and we find that the total amount of energy flowing through hunter-gatherer human societies globally was around 0.002% of the energy flowing through the terrestrial biosphere. And I've represented that as a small dot, red dot, in the center of the planetary surface, which is a representation of the energy flowing through in area, the energy flowing through the terrestrial biosphere. And the red dot is probably exaggerated in size there compared to its true amount. And also we can convert that into an area equivalent. That's the same amount of energy as flowing through 1,000 square kilometers of tropical forest. That was the total amount of energy flowing through humanity 10,000 years ago. If we go to just the eve of the Industrial Revolution around 1700 and calculate the amount of energy flowing through humanity, where we were farmers with agricultural systems, where ecosystems have been colonized and modified and appropriated for human use through agriculture, the total population had increased, and the total amount of energy flowing through humanity had increased to 3 terawatts, around 2% of total land biosphere energy. So getting more significant, but still fairly small compared to the total amount of energy flowing through the biosphere. And this, just for comparison, this is equivalent to the total amount of energy flowing through the country of Bolivia. And if we go to modern times, as we've gone through the Industrial Revolution and we're using more and more energy from fossil fuels in particular, the total amount of energy flowing through our growing and expanded global population is now around 17% of biosphere energy. And you can see this red circle becoming larger and larger comparative to the size of the planet. And this is about equivalent to the total amount of photosynthetic energy flowing through all of Amazonia. And so all of humanity and all the energy flowing through it is the same as the total amount of photosynthesis going through the vast tropical rainforests of Amazonia. And we can argue how much is too much. Certainly, the closer we approach to 100%, the more impact we have. Probably, I would argue something like 20% is probably enough. That's a significant impact already, but not reaching an overwhelming level that much larger numbers would imply. But if we look at a mid-range UNDP projection for 2050, in terms of population and economic growth, then the energy flow through the biosphere is equivalent to around 30, the energy flow through humanity is equivalent to around 32% of energy flowing through the terrestrial biosphere, or roughly the total amount of energy flowing through tropical forests worldwide. And we can look at other scenarios too. If we go to everyone having the same per capita consumption of the average citizen of China, which is much less than the average citizen of North America by comparison, we're looking at 40% of biosphere energy equivalent flowing through humanity. And if we go to a global US, where everybody on Earth has the same amount of per capita energetic metabolism as the average North American, we're looking at 120% of biosphere human energy flow equivalent to 120% of biosphere energy flow. And so we hit a point there that clearly human presence would be overwhelming in terms of the natural biogeochemical processes on Earth. And I think this is perhaps the most fundamental challenge that we face this century is how do we reconcile our growing global metabolism with maintaining stable planetary function and a living space for the rest of the denizens of the biosphere. And this large metabolic presence that humanity has on the Earth, I would argue, is the underlying and fundamental challenge where most of our other environmental challenges come from. So this metabolism needs energy, it needs resources to feed itself, and that leads to many of the challenges we face, such as resource depletion, overfishing, overharvesting of biological and non-biological resources. This metabolism also generates waste products, and that leads to, through excess CO2 in the atmosphere, leads to climate change, to ocean acidification, and to other features such as ocean plastics and other types of human and industrial waste. And this metabolism also occupies physical space on the terrestrial surface in terms of agricultural area for land to feed this metabolism, in terms of urban areas, infrastructure areas. And therefore, the more space this metabolism occupies, the less space is available for the rest of the biosphere, and therefore we have deforestation, habitat loss, and species extinction through habitat and land area loss. So many of our challenges can be seen as cascading off this fundamental challenge, the size of human metabolism. And so this fundamental challenge that we face this century of a growing presence on a finite problem, on a finite planet, this challenge has a name that's become increasingly popular and widely used in the last decade or so. This is the idea of the Anthropocene, the idea that we're moving into a new geological epoch, which is defined by humanity having an overwhelming presence on planetary function. So if we look at this figure here, this blue line could be taken as some sort of metric, like social metabolism, of increasing human presence on the planet. And there are a number of proposed rings there of possible start dates for the Anthropocene. And what's been happening in the last century or so is that there's been a great acceleration of this presence to the point that we're hitting potential planetary boundaries, and there are a possible number of pathways. Do we try and stabilize on some stable trajectory within these planetary boundaries, or do we find ourselves being pushed beyond and rupturing these planetary boundaries into a potentially unstable and dangerous future? And so the challenge we face is that there are two ways that we can limit the influence of the metabolism on biosphere diversity and life support mechanisms. One is by constraining the size of the metabolism so it does not grow any larger, and that could be argued to be about changing the quantity of the metabolism. But also another approach is to change the quality of the metabolism. And what I mean there is by changing the degree to which the economy within the metabolism is circular. To what extent can we use recycled products? To what extent can we use clean energy sources such as renewables as opposed to dirty sources such as fossil fuels? And therefore, the more we can cycle this metabolism internally within the metabolism, the weaker the interactions between this metabolism and the biosphere processes outside. So a key challenge that we face over this coming half century is tackling both constraining the quantity of our metabolism and the quality of our metabolism as well, as both as complementary strategies to limiting our impact. And many of the more explicit manifestations of environmental change are often described in terms of planetary boundaries that we're in danger of breaching. And this is one framing that helps us break down the impacts of this large metabolism. We can think of impacts on biosphere integrity, on climate change, on biochemical flows, on ocean acidification, and many others. In many cases, we're at risk of we already have breached these potential boundaries. In other cases, we're at risk of approaching these boundaries. So one of the key challenges we face when thinking about planetary function is how can we determine where these boundaries are? Are we approaching them? Is there a potential of navigating away from some of these boundaries, or at least sitting and hovering at those boundaries rather than breaching them. And I think in terms of a scientific challenge, this is one of the great challenges of Earth system science, is to work out where are the dangerous feedbacks and thresholds in the Earth system, and how close are we to breaching them. So when we go to tropical forests in particular, so when we go to thinking about these planetary boundaries, that there is a debate. There's an ongoing debate about whether there is really a planetary boundary in biosphere integrity, or whether most boundaries are actually local. It's what matters is in terms of diversity and function in any particular biome or region of a biome, rather than at any global scale. So there is a debate about to what extent a planetary biosphere boundary exists. But one of the most iconic of these potential boundaries is around tropical forests, and this was first highlighted by modelling work around the year 2000 by Peter Cox and others, where they used the first generation of coupled biosphere atmosphere models, where the biosphere properties fed back to the atmospheric properties. So therefore, you could have these feedback mechanisms appear. And what they showed is that under some scenarios, under a warming climate, the biosphere initially increased in biomass because of higher CO2 in the atmosphere, stimulating photosynthesis. At some point, there was a reversal in this trajectory, and the biosphere started releasing CO2 back to the atmosphere. And a key point of this reversal in these models was the Amazon rainforest. And under these models, under sufficient drying and warming, the Amazon started dying back and releasing CO2 to the atmosphere, and therefore acting as a further accelerator of climate change and the potential dangerous tipping point. So some of the key questions that we face when thinking about the Earth system is, how do we identify these boundaries? What role, in our interest in tropical forests, what role do tropical biomes play in determining regional and planetary boundaries? And what type of science is appropriate to address these questions? So now I'm going to take a little bit of a historical detour away from these Earth system questions and introduce this wonderful instrument, which is one of the first microscopes. And it was used by Hooke in the 17th century. And with one of the first microscopes, he started peering at biological samples to look at the structure of those samples. And when he looked, he came up with wonderful illustrations and diagrams, such as this diagram of a flea, showing that the microcosmos was full of detail that had previously not been imagined. The degree of detail in small organisms and in microorganisms was an undiscovered universe that this new instrument opened up to scientific eyes. And here's another example of Hooke's illustrations. This is shows a sample of cork bark, and what he saw when he looked at this is this cellular structure, and this led to the theory of the cell, and so a fundamental theory that biological organisms were built of a cellular structure. And this entire innovation in science was driven by a new technology, a new lens, literally, that enabled us to see things that were previously invisible, gave us observations that then required a whole new theory to develop around those observations to explain what we were seeing. Now, when we look at the Earth system, we have a similar set of new technologies that have emerged over the last half century that have given us literally new lenses to look at the challenges facing us at another scale that is invisible to the human eye. Just as the cell is invisible to the human eye, the planet itself and the functioning of the planet is invisible to the individual human eye. So instead of microscopes that Hooke used, well, what the new Earth system sciences have used are macroscopes, things that enable us to look at a much larger scale and understand the processes at those planetary scales. And this has led to a whole discipline of science, Earth system science, which examines the Earth as an integrated system, incorporating its physical, biological, chemical, and human dimensions. And just to give you an example of some of these macroscopes, one of the key ones has been the advent of remote sensing in particular. And I could give you dozens of possible examples, but here's one example of this macroscope at a very practical level, which is the Global Forest Watch tool that gives us high frequency updates on forest loss on an annual basis around the world. And we can see and track human influence on the planet in previously remote and inaccessible parts of the planet. Another one, which is one of my favorites, is this one, which uses a very different approach. So most remote sensing approaches use either optical or electromagnetic reflectance to look at properties of the planet. The GRACE mission uses something else. It uses the distortion in the gravitational field as measured by the distance between two satellites as they go around the Earth's surface. And from that, they infer the gravitational field of the Earth's surface and how it's distorted by the seasonal variation of water. So what we see here, for example, is the seasonal pulse of water in Amazonia and in the tropics through to the wet season and the dry season. And this can be seen in the distortion of the Earth's gravitational field. And this sort of imagery still takes my breath away, that we can see such patterns, such heartbeats of the Earth through subtle variations in the gravitational field as measured by the distance, micrometers of distance between two satellites in orbit. The other macroscope that is pivotal is the advent of advanced computational approaches that are able to simulate the Earth system at scale. And this little slide here shows the history of development of these global system models, from being very simplistic climate models in the 1970s to increasingly incorporating more and more feedbacks in the 1980s and early 90s, bringing in the carbon cycle, bringing in chemistry, bringing in interaction and dynamic vegetation. And so these models have become more and more sophisticated as our computational power has become more sophisticated. So now we are at a state where we have quite sophisticated but still challenged models of the Earth system with which to understand these feedbacks and interactions, and we need to inform these models from our observations, either through remote sensing or through ground observations. And here's an example of an output of these models. This shows the concentration of atmospheric moisture throughout the year. And we see here, day by day, the pulse of evaporation and atmospheric moisture over the tropical regions as the sun moves over each tropical region. And we see the moisture then circulating out of the tropics into higher latitudes, sort of swirling along eddies and jet streams into higher latitudes. So this is another example of the pulse of planet Earth and the role that tropics in particular play in shaping that pulse. And so we can use these modeling approaches to look and explore these feedbacks. So we can have a climate model with a climate response to greenhouse gas emissions. And then we can have an ecosystem model of the biosphere that feeds back, that responds to the climate, but also feeds back to the climate system. And it's really these modeling approaches that enable us to explore these feedbacks at planetary scale. And here's one example of a compilation of models. So these are a range of Earth system models, biosphere models used in IPCC. And these projections here show projections of vegetation carbon stocks in different tropical forest regions over the 21st century. And the colors represent different models. The black lines represent the observational data sets from forest plot networks in Amazonia and in Africa. And we see the models are predicting an increase in biomass over time, which is similar but smaller than the actual observed increase in biomass being seen by the forest inventory plots. Most of them show this biomass beginning to saturate by the late 21st century, but some of these models show earlier saturation, and some of them even show a reversal of the uptake of carbon, particularly in Amazonia, and particularly in a subset of the models, such as the UK Hadley Centre model, which suggests that there's some risk of dieback of the Amazon forest with sufficient warming and a release of carbon to the atmosphere. So one of the challenges we face in any modelling exercise is looking at the real complexity of tropical ecosystems. And here's an example photo of these systems that we as tropical ecologists, we love delighting in the complexity and the subtlety of function of these systems. And yet we need to somehow represent them in these computational models. And here's one example of such a computational model amongst the more sophisticated models. It's the LPJ, Dynamic Global Vegetation Model, and it incorporates a whole range of processes such as photosynthesis and ecophysiology. It has population dynamics, mortality, plant functional types, disturbance. So it's quite a complicated and sophisticated model, but it's still simple compared to the real complexity of the real ecosystem. So one of the challenges that we constantly face in this field is how do we reconcile the complexity of the system and get enough of it represented in these models, but not too much that the models become unwieldy or unworkable or overly complex. So the challenge is, how do we link our local level understanding of ecosystem process that comes through intense field work with this planetary scale function? And how much complexity is necessary and sufficient to achieve this linkage? And this, I would argue, is where the science of ecosystems ecology comes into the fore, because ecosystems ecology uniquely speaks, it works at the level of understanding in detail local ecosystems, but speaks the same language as the Earth system science in terms of biogeochemical and energy and water flows in ecosystems. And ecosystems ecology is the integrated study of living and non-living components of ecosystems and the interactions within an ecosystem's framework. It's studying the flow and energy and materials through organisms and through the physical environment. And the science of ecosystem ecology really kicked off in the early 20th century by the work of Arthur Tansley and others. Prior to that, ecology had been very much focused on either individual organisms or on populations and population demographics of organisms. But what Tansley and others argued is that it was important to understand the exchange of materials between organisms and their abiotic environment, rather than just understanding the organisms and the populations of organisms in themselves. And because in the case of the tropics, some of the real pioneers, and the real pioneer of this work was Howard Odum and his colleagues, particularly in the 1960s, with their work in Puerto Rico, which is summarized in this vast tome of a book that emerged in the 1970s from that work, where they did detailed studies and began to quantify the flow of energy through components of an ecosystem, cascading down from photosynthesis through to allocation and through onto higher trophic levels, animals and litter and soil organic matter and microbes. And this sort of ecosystem ecology had an early heyday in the 1960s and 70s, and then seemed to not move forward for a decade or so. And I think part of the issue there was that in itself, that ecology, that sort of ecosystem ecology, couldn't address the conservation and sustainability questions that it was seeking to address in the 60s and 70s. Now, to what extent does simply describing the energy flow or the nutrient flow through a system tell us about how we should conserve that system, or what the priorities and the practical strategies are for conservation? And so I think there was a mismatch in timing there. But what I would argue is that since the 80s and 90s, with the advent of the macroscopes and Earth system sciences, ecosystem ecology is back in terms of being highly relevant to trying to scale between this detailed ecological understanding of ecosystems and these questions of planetary functioning. And Some of the work that my team has been doing has been, in some ways, you could argue, a modern-day inheritor of this this work by Odum and others in the 1960s and 70s. So we, over the last decade, have set up something called the GEM network, the Global Ecosystems Monitoring Network, that is trying to describe ecosystem ecology at a range of sites across the tropics in particular. And we've developed a protocol and methodology that's available in this manual, that's available online, and anyone is welcome to download and replicate some of these protocols. And before I go into some of our results, I'll outline some of the key processes in the forest carbon cycle as the primary production level of ecosystems that we try and describe. So the total photosynthesis of a system can be described as the gross primary production, or GPP. Of that photosynthesis, a large fraction, typically 60 or 70%, is used in the metabolism of the plants themselves in terms of their growth and their maintenance, and released as CO2 from those plants. So this is described as the plant respiration. The rest is used by the plants to make organic matter, whether it's woods or leaves, flower or fruit, or coarse or fine roots. This is, all of these terms are termed the NPP, or the net primary productivity. All of that organic material ends up eventually as dead material, either every year through litter fall and root mortality, or eventually through whole plant mortality. This ends up as dead plant material. And then that is consumed by heterotrophs, overwhelmingly fungi and bacteria, to a much smaller extent herbivores and detritivores, and eventually, that process of consumption also releases CO2 as a byproduct, and that's the heterotrophic respiration of a system. So what we can do is aim to try and track this flow of carbon that can also be translated very easily, as I've argued, into a flow of energy and metabolism through the system. And we do this through a range of measurements that are within our protocol. We measure the tree growth of trees at a seasonal or monthly scale using dendrometers placed on the trees. We measure production of the canopy through litter fall traps and separate the litter out into flowers, fruit, and seeds and twigs. We try and measure below ground fine root production through in-growth cores and through screen rhizotrons, where we track the production rates below ground. We try and measure the rate of CO2 release from the soil through chamber measurements, where we place a chamber on the soil and measure the rate of CO2 uptake in that, as measured, CO2 release is measured by the accumulation of CO2 in that chamber. And we do a variety of experiments of root-free soil, root soil, litter soil, to look at the different components of that respiration. And we also do similar measurements on plant stems to try and get the woody component, and on leaves. This tends to be more a campaign mode because the canopy is much less accessible, but we do try and get some measurements at different seasons of leaf respiration and photosynthesis. And at all our sites, we try and collect climate data so we can match local climate and weather to variations in the carbon cycle. And here's an example of the types of annual budgets that we can do. This is for a forest in southern Peru, in Tambopata. And you see we can come up with quite a detailed description of the flow of energy, of carbon through the system, sort of a modern day successor to these pioneering diagrams that Odum and Kira and others were doing in the 1960s and 70s. And this involves a vast number of collaborators across all of these countries that are part of our GEM network. Just as a recent example, this is a little drone footage from our study site in Tapajós in Brazil from this month, from April, just showing our assistants doing some stem respiration measurements in a forest plot. This forest plot was burnt during the 2015-16 El Niño, and I'll get back to some of the results emerging from these burnt plots later on in this talk. But this is just to give you an example of the types of measurements that we're doing at these plots around the tropics over time. Other sites that we work at are in Southeast Asia. Here's an example in Sabah in Malaysia. And also a real priority for us has been to expand the data collection network in Africa, where, until recently there'd been no ecosystem productivity direct measurements. So here's an example of our team in Gabon doing rooting growth work. And a couple of years ago in Gabon, we had our workshop where we first calculated the productivity of 6 forest plots in Gabon, which are shown in the center here. On the left, we have Amazonian site. On the right, we have Borneo sites. And you can see this was the first visibility of data from Africa. Our colleagues in Ghana obviously didn't want to be left behind. So a month later, we had a similar workshop in Ghana. And you can see this African data set expanded substantially with a much larger data set appearing from Ghana as well. And some surprises. If you look at the total size of the bars, the productivity that we were measuring in some of these African sites was higher than anything we'd previously measured in Amazonia and even in Borneo. Just as a side issue, we were also interestingly interested in the higher trophic levels of energy flow. So this is some work that we're having progress, where we're trying to quantify how much of this primary production of energy ends up in higher trophic levels. And this is data estimated from mammal abundance populations from our project site in Borneo. And we see the total amount of energy being consumed by mammals in an old growth rainforest, in a heavily logged forest, and an oil palm plantation, and where the energy is coming from to support those mammals. And what you see is an interesting contrast. There's much more energy flowing through into mammals in the logged forest rather than the old growth forest. And why this is happening is because the forest is opening up. There's much more leaf canopy available at ground level, where it's accessible to large herbivores like deer and elephants. And so there is much more consumption going on because food is much more accessible, but also because plants are prioritizing rapid growth to compete for light, they're often much less chemically defended. And so this material is much more palatable and more nutritious. So for both those two factors, we're seeing a huge increase in energy flow to higher trophic levels in the logged forest compared to the old growth forest, showing the value that there is in logged forest still in terms of supporting biodiversity and animal life. And when we get to the oil palm, there is much less energy flow overall in the oil palm system. So much less animal life can be supported in the oil palm system than compared to the logged and old growth forests. So for the next part of my talk now, I'm going to focus on one particular case study to give you an example of how we can use this energetic carbon flow data to look at the questions related to planetary boundaries in Earth system science. And I'm going to focus on the El Niño of 2015 and 2016. So if we look at the global flux of CO2 to the atmosphere, we see this type of diagram, which is now familiar to almost all of us, where we see the emissions from fossil fuels and industry rising over time, becoming a dominant source of our emissions. There's also ongoing emissions from land use change, primarily tropical deforestation, that carries high uncertainty, but it's pretty flat over time. And if we look at where this total accumulation of CO2 is going, we understand quite well how much is ending up in the ocean carbon sink, which is where it's contributing to ocean acidification. That's about a quarter of the total emissions. And a further 50% or so ends up in the atmosphere, and that's very well quantified. And because the atmosphere is well mixed, and so from a few measurements of CO2, we can estimate the atmospheric stock. And the rest must be going into the land surface. And two features stand up. Firstly, about a quarter of our CO2 emissions are being absorbed by the biosphere in one form or another. And I think a significant part of this is the intact biosphere and tropical forests in particular. But secondly, this land biosphere component is highly variable. There are some years where it switches to almost zero, and other years that is quite a substantial carbon sink. So a key question here, the two things we need to understand here is, firstly, what is causing this carbon sink? And what's its likely future trajectory? Is it likely to keep increasing in importance or start decreasing over time as various processes may saturate? But secondly, what's causing this interannual variation? Is this interannual variation simply a natural, interesting feature of the Earth system, or is it a flickering, an early warning sign of potential instability in the terrestrial biosphere that could cause this carbon sink to turn into something neutral, or even possibly a source of carbon, where it could become an accelerator of global warming and climate change? And we know this flickering is driven by the terrestrial tropics. This figure shows in red the temperature of tropical land regions, and in green the rate of growth of CO2 in the atmosphere globally, and you see a very strong correlation. So when during El Niño events, which are these dark bars, the tropics are warmer, and also there seems to be a surge of CO2 to the atmosphere. So it's quite likely that something to do with the warming of the tropics is causing these peaks of CO2 emission to the atmosphere that drive this interannual fluctuation. So this is something that our GEM network is quite well placed to address. So the questions that we know that something's happening in the tropics in terms of this variability, but there are lots of things that we don't understand. Are particular tropical regions responsible for this variability, or is this a generic widespread phenomenon? Which mechanisms are responsible for this anomaly? Is it a decrease in photosynthesis, an increase in plant respiration, or soil respiration, or fire, or tree mortality? And which local climate variables are most important in driving the response? Is it driven by drought or by temperature, or what other factors? And fundamentally, is this variability an early warning of longer-term instability in the tropical biosphere carbon sink? And so the El Niño was the strongest, at least since the 2015-2016 El Niño, but this time, unlike in the late 90s, we had a whole new and powerful suite of macroscopes to observe and model it, ranging from satellites. We had our ground observation networks across the tropics like GEM, and we also had sophisticated modeling networks that we could, modeling approaches that we could employ. So if we look and try and characterize the patterns of this El Niño, this one shows total annual precipitation in tropical forest regions. And what we see is a strong anti-correlation with El Niño. So during strong El Niños, the total amount of rainfall in the tropics reduces. This is mainly driven by strong reductions in Amazonia and in Southeast Asia, and increased rainfall over the ocean, over the Pacific Ocean in particular. But, and also that there's an accompanying warming of tropical land regions. So you see a strong peak in temperatures in 97 and then again in 2015, 2016. But a really important point here is that the warming peaks during an El Niño are sitting on top of a long-term warming trend strongly associated with global warming. So even though the El Niño of 97, 98 was similar in strength to the El Niño of 2015, 2016, the later El Niño led to much higher maximum temperatures because it was sitting on top of 20 years of further global warming. So each time we have a strong El Niño, we're pushing the tropics and the planet in general into previously unexplored climate space, into new climate territory. So looking at the impacts of this El Niño is one possible way of trying to understand what lies ahead of us in terms of the impacts of a warming planet on biosphere function. And if we look at the spatial pattern of the impacts of the El Niño across the tropics, we also see some really strong patterns. The impacts in precipitation weren't spread evenly across the tropics. The strongest drought was in eastern Amazonia in particular, but also in parts of Southeast Asia. And the temperature anomaly was also focused very strongly in areas that experienced the strongest warming and drying, such as bits of Amazonia, eastern Amazonia in particular. There were other types of macroscopes available to look at this. One other example is the global network of flasks. And from this, it's possible by combining the data on atmospheric CO2 observations with the data on movement of CO2 around the atmosphere, and then using weather meteorological models to back calculate where these anomalies in CO2 came from. It's possible to try and estimate from the atmospheric observations where the sources and sinks of CO2 were during the El Nino. And here's a result of this very independent type of work by Christian Rodenberg, which shows that the likely sources of CO2 were located in the tropics. So the darker brown regions were particularly located in eastern Amazonia as a hotspot of emission. This also gives us a spatial signature of El Nino. So with our GEM network, we tracked the carbon cycle of tropical forests and savannas at 54 plots across the tropics. And this included a whole range of measurements, such as 187,000 dendrometer measurements and a range of other data. And I'm just giving you an example here of how we use these data to try and describe the variation in growth rate. So here we're looking at tree growth rates across a range of these sites, and we apply a simple statistical generalized linear model to try and fit climate, driven by climate data, try and fit and predict the seasonal variation of growth. And we see this general model that we apply across all our sites does quite well in some sites in predicting variability. In Amazonia and northern Bolivia, does less well in some of the aseasonal sites, some of the wetter sites, but overall it does a fairly good job. And then we can scale this up using the meteorological data to come up with this estimate of the woody growth of the entire tropical forest biome. Okay, it's still 55 sites, so it's limited, but at least we've got a reasonable spread of climate and soil types to try and capture the seasonal variation. And this is a attempted simulation based on our observations of the total woody production of the tropical forest biome over this period. And overall, we see around 5 petagrams or gigatons of woody biomass are created by the world's tropical forests every year. And then if we look at the anomalies during the El Nino, we can see where there were anomalies in terms of reduced growth. And we see the strongest reductions were in Amazonia and in parts of East and Southeast Asia, particularly New Guinea. And this in the 97 El Nino, when we look at the 2015 El Nino, we see a pattern with, again, the strongest anomalies in Amazonia, but anomalies widespread across the tropics. So what we do see here is some pattern of generalized widespread impact, but also impacts being particularly strong in some areas, such as Eastern Amazonia. We can do similar model fitting approaches to stem respiration, to total net primary production, to soil respiration, and the other components, and come up with these sorts of maps and scaling of those components. And then sum them up over the entire tropics to look at the total estimated anomaly in primary production across the tropics. And what we see is evidence of a reduction in primary production during El Ninos in 97 and in 2016. There's a reduction in overall primary production. At the same time, there's an increase of respiration from plants, but even more strongly, an increase in respiration from the soil in many cases. So both microbial and plant production or respiration increases during these El Nino events. And so scaling those up, we can end up with a map of the total carbon emissions anomaly during the year 2015-2016 El Nino. And what we see is that the anomaly is very focused in some particular regions, such as Eastern Amazonia comes out very strongly in this analysis. Parts of Africa do, peninsular Southeast Asia, but less insular Southeast Asia come out very strongly. And looking at this totally independent atmospheric CO2 data that I showed a few slides ago, we see that there is broad correspondence with this very totally independent data set, that there's a strong anomaly in Amazonia, there's some sort of anomaly in Africa, and a weaker anomaly in Asia, particularly focused on peninsular Southeast Asia. So there is some correspondence here between these two approaches. which gives us increased confidence that we're seeing and simulating something that's real. So the question we can ask is, does this anomaly that we observe in our gem plots explain the tropical forest anomaly that we observe? So this blue line here shows the rate of accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere as observed from global atmospheric records, and the black line shows the estimate from scaling up our forest plots of how much of this emission is coming from our intact tropical forest, or largely intact tropical forest plots. And we see that there is a broad correspondence during the El Niños. We seem to be accounting for around half of the anomaly, but it doesn't seem to explain all of the anomaly. So what could be explaining the rest? Well, firstly, there are many biomes that we're not including, even in the tropics. We're not including the drier biomes, the savannas and grasslands and mangroves, all of which could be making a contribution. And secondly, there are processes that we're not including. We're not looking at fire generally and scaling up fire across these observations, and in particular as a process. So what could explain the rest of this? What could explain this discrepancy beyond the other biomes between our observations and the total rate of rise of CO2 from the tropics? Well, one clue comes from this imagery. This is drone footage that we took over our site near Santarém in Brazil in the aftermath of the El Niño. The first part showed an intact old-growth forest, and this showed areas of forest where half of the trees are dead. All those branches you see, this is not deciduousness, this is tree death. So what could be causing this pattern of extensive tree death? So here's the old growth forest again, and here's the forest that half the trees have died. And what was causing this death was fire, but not extensive damaging crown fires as you might expect, but these fires, these are actually from some of these plots where a litter fire goes through, leaks out of agricultural areas and goes through these crispy litter layers and burns at quite a low intensity. So you can walk over these fires, you can stop them by kicking the litter out the way. They're not dangerous in a life-threatening way, but they end up leading in the death of half of the trees in these forest plots. And if we look at what's happening in Amazonia over time, the spread of these burnt areas of forest is during climate extreme events such as the 2010 drought and the 2016 El Niño drought is becoming a prevalent feature of Amazonia. So the orange line here shows the rate of deforestation, and the green line shows the total amount of forest that is being burned. And you see these strong peaks during dry events. So there's this interaction between climate extreme events, which are likely to become more common and more intense under climate change scenarios, as the interaction between these climate extreme events and the fragmentation and the spread of ignition points in the forest landscape that have led to this surge of fire incidents. And some of the new work that we're doing in this area is working to understand the mechanisms by which these fires cause tree mortality and what can be done in terms of management interventions to potentially slow down or intervene to minimize the risk of extensive forest fire extent during these dry spells. So that sounds like a slightly gloomy point to come towards the end of this talk on. So how do we reconcile ourselves to all these challenges that we're facing in the tropics? And I want to end this symposium by this diagram, which I think gives me some sort of framework and how I think about the work that we're doing in the tropics and what it means for the long-term future of the tropics. So on the left, we have a situation that existed to some extent in the tropics centuries ago or millennia ago, of an intact biosphere with biotic mixing, multi-trophic interactions, lots of heterogeneity in the landscape. And this intact biosphere has been under increasing pressure. And the pressure comes from two main sources. One is land use and forest use associated drivers, including deforestation, fragmentation, harvesting, directly affecting the system. And the other one comes from climate change, atmospheric change, and that's causing climatic extreme events and also affecting these ecosystems. So both of these can be perceived as these red belts that are tightening this ecosystem and constraining these ecosystems. So it's tempting to feel gloomy and to feel that these increasing pressures are part of a one-way funnel. These systems are being funneled into interminable decline. But I would argue that there are reasons for hope that in the future, at least in some regions and in some contexts, this pressure on these ecosystems will decline over time. In terms of land and forest use drivers, it's possible that many of these systems will go through a forest transition, as has occurred in much of the temperate biosphere over the last century, where there's less pressure on some marginal forest lands. So we've seen over the last century a great expansion of forests in North America and in Europe, and more recently in East Asia. And so we can see decreasing pressure in some contexts, but also in terms of climate change, we can hope that that we'll really get to grips with this fossil fuel problem, both through governance and technological approaches. And there is some scenario of stabilized atmospheric CO2 or a decreased rate of increase of global warming over the next few decades. And what emerges from this, through this bottleneck, is a range of systems. They could either be, they will be different from the ecosystems that existed prior to this bottleneck, but they could still be diverse and functionally intact and robust and resilient ecosystems, or they could be diminished and degraded ecosystems, have little biodiversity content, little functionality, and little resilience to climate variability and other pressures. And so the more, I would argue, the more that we can keep this bottleneck from being narrow by having these interventions and responses that keep this bottleneck as wide as possible, either at local or at larger scales, the more prospect we have of rich and functional systems and the less prospect of diminished ecosystems. So this, I think, is the fundamental challenge and call that we have for this generation of tropical ecologists, conservationists and scientists. How can we intervene and understand the processes that are causing these constraints, and then inform the policy that can help keep this bottleneck as wide open as possible to give tropical ecosystems and all other ecosystems worldwide as much of a chance as possible to be functional and resilient over the 21st century and beyond. And with this, to what extent can we keep this green pulsing heart of the biosphere alive and thriving over the century to come and over the millennia and millions of years to come, so that it stays functional in the way it has over the last many millions of years and has sustained the rich context in which humanity has emerged on Earth. So thank you. I'd like to thank a whole range of colleagues and collaborators that made this possible, in particular Sami Rifai and Ben Hennig for the analyses that contributed directly to this talk, and funding from a range of sources. So thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar, and I look forward to some questions and debates immediately after the webinar. And beyond that, feel free to contact me either by email or through Twitter, and let's keep this conversation and debate going. So thank you very much.